morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. It's Matt Coleman, your host from Magnify World, speaking from our Los Angeles studio. Today, we have two special guests from the UK. One in London, Damian Hale, who's the creative director of a company called Treatment, and the co-founder, Willi Williams. He's up in Suffolk. How are you guys?
Yeah, I'm okay, yeah.
Late in the evening for you, morning here. Look, we've got an interesting conversation coming up. This is all around multimedia content production. For mostly, your careers have been in the live music event. When I say stadium live music and the creative processes around that, I know that you do set design, stage lighting, interactive and mixed reality, and you've dabbled in augmented reality as well. We're going to be talking about, first of all, if you guys could give us some background on how you actually got into the industry. You've been working with some of the largest groups on the planet, including Adele, U2 you've had a long-standing relationship with, and the Rolling Stones, and a lot of other artists like John Mayer, and the list goes on. So, yeah, how did you get into the music business and also on the production side? Willie, would you like to go first?
Sure, as I'm the oldest. It's funny, my story, I always feel like it's interesting, but I don't think it's very helpful for young people who ask how to get into the industry, because I was fortunate that growing up in the UK, I grew up in the north of England, but just as I was leaving school, just as I was doing my A-levels, is when punk rock kicked in. And suddenly every directionless youth in the nation had a vision for how the world could be. And I had friends that were in bands and this, that, and the other, and really wanted to be part of that world and that life. But I didn't really have any idea how I might go about it. And I was, I was bright and did well at school, and I'd applied to go to university in London because that's where it was all going on. And I was going to do physics at University College. And then about 2 weeks before I was supposed to start, I was living in London and just realized that the only reason I was going to university is because I didn't have a better plan, and realized I might have found one. So spent the next few years doing every hellhole pub and club in the nation and across Europe with bands that would form for a while and split up, and then eventually started working with people that other people had heard of, and always much more interested in the visual side of things than the audio side of things, and principally obviously lighting was the main tool in those small venues. But it really is kind of a straight line between here and there. One thing leads to another. And I met the U2 guys in 1982 when we were all children. And that obviously, that's been kind of the spine of my career, I suppose. And what's been wonderful about working with them, aside from the fact that they're creatively amongst the most ambitious people that have ever lived, is they would do these huge projects, but then take long breaks. So I was always able to have my own life in tandem with that. Yeah, and then years go by, and when moving lights, I was less enamored by, because I could see immediately that all the shows started to look the same. But when video started to appear, sort of in the late 80s, I realized that that was actually a very interesting tool for creating stage visuals. And from that point, really, it was much more about creating multimedia shows than just shows based on lighting. So that was kind of how I came in. And along the way, met Sam Pattinson, who was a video producer, who introduced me to a whole bunch of talented young people. And we ended up forming Treatment as a company, as a sort of base for all these people to work out of. So
excellent. And Damian, how about you?
I met Damian. There we go.
Yeah. Of course.
I started. I similarly came to learn. Was always, like Willie said, music was probably the thing that always drove me. But I never really played. I was always from a visual sort of, coming at it from a visual point of view. And I ended up in London because I knew people who worked at record labels and needed a bit of help with some graphics here and there, and the odd music video that I'd basically make on a borrowed camcorder, and And back then, you couldn't sort of, it wasn't easy to just kind of edit something or make, you needed quite expensive gear. So I had to sort of blag a video and then learn how to do it on the really expensive gear while I was making it. So that was my sort of training, was doing bits and pieces like that. And through that, I ended up meeting And at the time, you know, doing this kind of thing, the live thing, I didn't really think was an option. You know, I always really liked, you know, but it was more music videos and little bits and pieces like that. And then I met these guys called Vegetable Vision, who were the first people, as far as I was aware, who, you know, somehow had made a living out of making live, not live video, because they were kind of friends with the Chemical Brothers, and they'd been doing the clubs with them when they were still DJs, and then when they became like a sort of stadium act, they'd sort of taken these guys with them. And it turns out one of Vegetable Vision was a childhood friend of Sam Pattinson's. So I met him through Adam, and yeah, and then sort of met Willie through Sam, and it just became, I mean, for me, you know, once I started doing the live thing, I didn't really look back, because doing the, you know, my day job had been sort of, like I say, making bits and pieces, the odd music video stuff for TV, and it was lovely. I really enjoyed it, but it was seeing things in context and seeing a crowd react to what you've done is pretty addictive. And once that started, it was hard to move away from that. So I did like a lot of, you know, as well as making stuff, I'd quite often end up sort of mixing live, like VJing at sort of clubs and festivals and things here and there. Back in the day when it involved carrying like 2 suitcases full of tapes into the middle of a field. So yeah, and then Willie and I met about probably a terrifying amount of time ago now. Like,
yeah, probably about 20 years ago. Yeah,
it's getting on, isn't it?
yeah. It was at least 15. So.
When I was like a young, exciting.
And tell us, what was the first major event, Willie, that you finally realised that LED walls and multimedia was going to be a big thing? I mean, was it one of the large U2 shows, one of the first ones you did? I know we talked about some innovations in LEDs.
Yeah.
LED walls, how you even stuck them together from what I
read. Yeah. No, because obviously prior to LED, I started working with video prior to LED. You know, LED just used to be the little red light on your hi-fi. And actually I worked with David Bowie for 3 years, and his Sound and Vision tour, which was 1990, used very large-scale film projection, which ran in sync with the music. There were very large images of him, film images, 70mm film images of him, which ran in lip sync with what he was doing. And it was SMPTE, it all ran by SMPTE time code. And it was a bugger to get right because film, of course, is a physical thing. And depending on the temperature, the piece of film will actually change size. So that was really tricky, but very, very educational. And it was very art. Obviously, being Bowie, it was coming from a completely art place. And he worked with a guy called Edward Locke, who had a contemporary dance company out of Montreal called La 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 Human Steps. They're French-Canadian, so it probably makes more sense in French. But super, super creative group and very interesting choreographer. And he worked with Bowie, and then I actually worked with La 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 subsequently. But this was his technique, where he would hang a gauze screen, very fine gauze screen, over the front of the stage and project onto it images that were made out of black. And so they just appeared to hang in space. And if you light somebody behind the screen, you see them perfectly, but you don't see the screen at all. And these sort of hybrid images of David and his own images, enormous and singing lip sync, were really, really arresting. And I could see in the very early video systems, I befriended a company in San Francisco called Nocturne, who were the first people really that were putting out touring video systems. And they were just screens and cameras, just projection screens and cameras to present close-ups of the artists to the people at the back, so they could sell the cheap seats would get more expensive. And Nocturne were actually involved with this American band Journey, who one forgets how huge they were over there. But Journey invested in this company, and I always say that it was Journey that invented iMag, actually. I mean, it's long, long forgotten because they weren't exactly an art band, but they really were at the forefront of producing these touring systems. And I did a couple of touring tours basically as an intern to find out how it works, one of which was with Frank Sinatra, which is a story for another day. But I could see between all of these things, I could see that something new was coming, and we were absolutely only beginning to dip our toe in the water of what would be possible. So the result of that, very fortunately, U2 had reached the end of their first incarnation, and they were really looking to blow themselves up and do something entirely new. So the result of all of the above was Zoo TV, which was a stadium tour they did in 1992-93, which really was the first, it was sort of the first modern rock show, really. It's the first show you could look at from back then that actually looks anything like shows do now. But it was projection screens, and it was eventually we moved on to video cubes, which we thought were terribly hip, but all very, you know, daylight unfriendly and this, that, and the other. So lots to learn, but the show itself made a lot of ripples. And actually, to be honest, having done such a video heavy show with U2, initially I wasn't that interested in doing another big video based show with them, because I sort of felt like we'd done that. But at that point I started working with Mark Fisher, who was the most fantastic collaborator, as you can imagine. And he, I think, was the one who started looking at LED products. And back then LEDs literally were used for motorway signs and this, that, and the other, because there was no blue. Initially, there were no blue LEDs, or they were unbelievably expensive. So long story short, for U2 subsequent tour, we proposed what was essentially the world's first low-res LED screen, because blue LEDs had appeared, and we figured it was possible by separating the pixels of a screen. The images would get softer and dimmer, but you're using them in the dark, so you've got tons of headroom. But when we realized we were talking about the possibility of filling the end of a stadium with a video picture, then we were suddenly very interested again. And for that tour, I mean, it's quite forgotten really, but for that tour, U2 built and paid for the very first low-res LED video screen that had toured. And it was hand-built by Belgians. It wasn't waterproof. We were playing outdoors, and we drove it over the Andes. So it was really touch and go. But once that bomb dropped, that was it. And when you look at Zoo TV now, Zoo TV, I think, was the ideas were much more. It was more ambitious in a way for its time. But when you look at Pop Mart now, that's the one. I mean, Pop Mart could go out tomorrow and would still look fresh. You know, it really, that absolutely defined how rock shows have looked for the last 20 years. So, as I say, that was an exciting thing to do. And after that, again, you know, being slightly contrary, I will always look for something new. But it was clear that once the LED genie was out of the bottle, there was no getting it back in again.
Well, we're going to talk about then and now, and I hand it over to you, Damian. There's a project about it's completely opposite to music, of course, here, but about the moon landing, because it's a virtual reality project. And I know we're going to talk about emerging tech and what we think about that and where it's all going. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Damian, and that crosses into the John Mayer conversation, the global tour that you did last year?
Well, that particular job, so the Apollo job, it's actually a kind of immersive theatre thing, but to design it, we needed to be able to immerse ourselves in it, because we were designing like a 360 domed image, which is very unforgiving to look at on a computer screen, obviously. So that was probably the first time that we toyed with using VR for some visualization before, which, you know, was nice for us, but it probably wasn't necessary. It was quite a nice novelty at first, but this was the first job, I think, where we actually, you know, you could say we couldn't really have done it without it, because you just couldn't get a feel for how things looked without, you know, even though it was quite, you know, the actual sort of space we designed, it was quite detailed, but it obviously, you know, perhaps it wasn't sort of hyper realistic, but it just gave you the ability to put your head inside the space and get a feel for scale and you know, how things distorted, and it was like, so it was a completely essential part of the process, to the point where we got a standalone headset, one of the Oculus sort of standalone headsets, and sent that out to the director so that we could send him updates as we made stuff, because again, if we just sent him like a massive super widescreen distorted QuickTime, it wouldn't really sell anything, you know. So it was completely essential for, I'd say that's probably the one job where VR we couldn't have done without VR, because like I say, we use it quite a lot. We did we did a job in the LA, the Disney concert hall in LA, which, you know, it was really useful for things like that as well. But yeah, I think the Apollo job was the one where definitely it would have been impossible to do without VR.
Well, definitely Facebook is going prime time with, you know, their series of headsets. They just announced a $100 drop actually in price for the new Quest, which has a lot of higher quality
That's a good idea,
and a lot of gaming applications as well. I've noticed watching the NBA playoffs this week in LA that they are all over the joint with their advertising, with Oculus in particular. So they're making quite a large investment, which is terrific for the whole industry.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Like time has got to be right for it, hasn't it? You know, I mean, I think when we're all locked in, you know, locked indoors, anything that gives us a feeling of getting out in some actual space, it's got to be a...
Did I hear that you worked with Virtuality Dome theatres as well? Well, they're 360, I guess. Is that what I heard with the moon landing, or was it more of a VR?
Yeah, the Apollo show was within a portable touring dome.
It was, right. Yeah, that's what I thought.
So the VR element was more, you know, it was actually for our benefit building it, but you know, like I say, because it was such a bespoke, like the actual sort of setting was so sort of particular, and you just couldn't do it any other way. You had to see the stuff in situ. You had to basically be able to stand inside the sphere to be able to see what worked and what didn't, you know. And it was actually, it was amazing at first actually how we realized how essential it was as we did it, because, you know, stuff that looked great when it was flat suddenly looked completely wrong when it was, and vice versa. You know, sometimes you'd see something that you didn't expect to look as powerful as it did. And, you know, like I say, not just because of the distortion, but also the scale, the sense of scale. You know, it's really hard to, that's why, you know, we end up often changing so much stuff when we're on site as well, you know, because we design, you know, however much video, but when you get there and see it in situ, it's always a different thing. So being able to sort of get a little bit ahead of that using VR is incredibly useful for us.
And what about, look, talking about, you know, COVID's obviously got things on hold, but there are concerts going on in Fortnite with Travis Scott and the rest of them, drawing millions of people. There's drive-in theatres. I'm not sure what's going on in the UK in regards to, and Europe in regards to drive-ins, Willie or Damian. I mean, what are your thoughts on the future here? And I can really see that VR could be, you know, if you're doing a virtual concert and you're creating the set, you could stream this out to a, you know, quite a large audience. I know it's not the same as what you know, we've sort of grown up with, you know, having.
That's the key. I think there are technologies that will emerge. It's like war, basically. There are technologies that will emerge because of the war on COVID that will stay with us. I don't think there's anything that could replace the concert experience. I think it's and similarly with sport, you know, there isn't an equivalent, but perhaps other forms will emerge that stay with us and are, you know, interesting companions to the live experience. So, no, I mean, everybody's looking for the silver bullet over here, and nobody has found it. And it's pretty obvious why, really. It is like cooking for yourself rather than being fed in a restaurant. And it's because the sense of community is the thing. And for me, that's what a show stands or falls on. And the fantastic thing about a stadium concert is that you're experiencing this thing with so many other live human beings. It's sort of what we've lost with home video, really, where when everyone used to sit in the dark and watch a film together. There is something about that many alpha waves emitting from all these brains all over the room, and it really does do something. So that obviously is missing from any kind of VR experience, but that's not to say that it's not a useful thing to explore, because new things will emerge. Gaming, particularly. I mean, I think it's absolutely made for gaming.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What about the AR experience? We chatted last week, Willie, around one you tested for U2, and there was a special app that you downloaded before you went to the stadium. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
What we did, that was actually for an indoor show. It was for their Experience in Innocence tour. in 2018, and that show was one of a pair of shows. There was the Experience show, and then the Innocent show had come a couple of years before. But the stage ran long ways down the arena floor, and looking at it from above, the screen was a long screen sat right in the middle of the arena, running long ways, and it could move. So when it dropped down to ground level, it divided the audience in half on the floor, and we'd got all kinds of use out of it. And also it's transparent screen, so you could put the performers inside it, and made all kinds of hybrid images with performers and recorded material, sort of echoes of the Bowie thing I talked about earlier. But having done it for a while, I was looking at this thing and wondering if there was a use for AR within the show, because everyone's looking at the damn show through their phones anyway. And the key to it really was whether from the back of an arena, if a screen that size could occupy enough of your phone screen to trigger an AR event. And so that was kind of where it started, because I was absolutely determined there wouldn't be instructions, it had to be completely intuitive. So long story short, the only way to do it was we did a full-size test. We borrowed the O2 in London, which I guess you can do if you're U2. And it did work. So we built the app ourselves, we did the whole thing. And for me, it was going to be the opening of the show, but in order for it not to be clunky and, press the red button now, we built a pre-show. It was a 45-minute pre-show experience. And when you come in, the screen is on the floor, so it's filling the stage. And when you look at it through your phone, the entire thing was frozen. It was an iceberg. And it's also snowing. If you look around the room, it's snowing. And you see all the regular people and this, that, and the other, but you're in this completely frozen environment. And over 45 minutes, it begins to melt. And the iceberg begins to melt, and it becomes a waterfall, which then floods the floor of the arena. And various objects that you will see later in the show start bombing around in the water on the floor. And what that does, that gave the audience an opportunity to educate each other in what was going, because for every person doing it, there'd be 10 standing around them looking and figuring it out, which meant that by the time the show started, people understood what this was about. And the real opening of the show was the screen lifts and it reveals Bonos suspended in the space, singing a song about dying, which is a U2 thing. And it's a very sort of choral vocal piece. And above him, if you look through the phone, above him is this gigantic avatar of Bono, which is singing in lip sync with the live vocal. And it really was singing in lip sync with the live vocal, which of course we still think is impossible, but somehow we managed to do it. So I was really pleased with how seamless that experience was. And then once it was done, it was done. And, we got on with the show. And I was very pleased with the technology. I was very pleased with the way it looked. I mean, it was the most counterintuitive way to start a rock show you can imagine. But of course, the discussions we would have, much, much later were, did it really do anything in terms of connection within the audience, or was it an emotional experience? Was it just a cerebral experience? And I'm not sure that we answered those questions, but it was really a privilege to be able to do an experiment on that scale.
Good place to try it in front of probably 60,000 people.
Yeah. It was indoors, so it was only about sort of 15 to 20.
Oh, yeah.
It was more, and also because you're indoors, you've got control of the atmosphere as well.
Yeah.
But it was a really interesting thing to do, and I watched it from all over the building on various nights. And it was quite fascinating because if you're on the floor, you are looking up underneath this gigantic version of Bono, and if you're at the back, it was quite a fascinating thing to try.
And it was nice. There were things like we had the kind of spirits flying around the room and stuff, which was quite nice. So there was actually things to find. It did. You're right though. Whether it as a thing adds.
Yes, I suppose it was done. We did it in the same spirit that we did the LED screen. It's like, this is a really interesting thing. We could make something that looks really beautiful and do something interesting here. And then you just sort of put it out there in the world and see what happens next. And obviously LED just went all the way. Whereas I don't think that AR in shows is going to go quite the same way. But it was really interesting to do.
Can you see? I mean, one of the obvious things I've always thought about is having a 360 camera right on top of the drummer or even near
Sure.
over the bassist or near the performers, so you could actually in VR even get on stage, basically. I know it's been tried before at festivals, but do you get much pushback from the performers on using some of this technology? Or do you think that's a good idea? Do you think that, 360 is obviously more of a basic version of, mixed reality, of course, but that's where you start. But I think, to be on stage with the band would be fantastic.
Yeah. I mean, the question with all these things is really what's it for? Because unsurprisingly, these things are not inexpensive to do. And because I think Muse was the first band I saw that did a serious 360 shoot like you've described. And that was quite a long time ago. And so the fact that they're not commonplace, I think, speaks to that a little bit. There's either not enough return from the investment, or still getting people used to watching music on a screen, on a small screen, I think is tricky. Because I mean, what's so ironic now about all the lockdown broadcasts, etc., was that live music, concert films had no value at all prior to lockdown. They started in the 80s as pay-per-view one-off events and this, that, and the other, and then went to DVD. And now you can't sell a concert DVD. I mean, with very, very few exceptions, they just do not sell at all. And so it's rather ironic that they've now become the principal currency of live music. But,
yeah. And Damian, tell us more about the creative processes that you go through. I mean, do you start with, is it the design, the lighting? Do you go back? Do you think about how you can use mixed reality? Yeah, if you're working, are you working on projects very far in advance? I suspect, particularly in the global nature of touring, you're obviously a couple of years out, possibly. Can you tell us a little bit about how you work with your clients?
Yeah, I mean, it varies. To be honest, it varies completely from one client to another. So sometimes it might just be, they might have no idea whatsoever. Just you just get the songs and you get, complete free reign, which is nice in its own way. Sometimes there's, obviously certain songs might have sort of a certain amount of meaning, and certain sets and stages might be very particular to work within as well. So it's, I think for me, like I always quite like it if they bring something to start with, because I like to feel that much as I'd like everyone to come and see me just doing what I want to do, I think at the end of the day, I want there to be that honesty that it is, whatever you're doing, you want it to be representing the band. Because to me, that's, when I was a kid watching music videos and things, I believed that was the band talking to me and showing me what they, so I definitely want that. I like to I would prefer there to be that kind of level of,
yeah, for sure.
Interaction. So, for example, I know we talked before about like someone like John Mayer, for example, is a really lovely client to work with, because he definitely always has something that he wants to say or something that he wants to express. So, the conversation will always start from an idea which he would bring to the table. And it might be, it might vary a lot in how much detail there is in it, but I really like that as a starting point. So, for example, the last time, because the last two tours I've worked on with him, the first time was all about video. It was all, we made an entire kind of video set, which he was kind of pretty much alone for a lot of it in the middle of. And that was amazing, obviously, because it was like, we were creating worlds for him, and he really liked this idea that he was almost running his own TV show. And it was kind of like, it was almost kind of like a sort of fantastical evening with, but he was kind of, he was like your kind of compare as well as your entertainment sort of thing, and taking you into different places. So it would range from, like things that were more recognizably a movie to things that were just a living set that he would be part of. Second time around, last time, obviously, because we'd done that, the sort of starting point was anything but that this time. And he was really in a place where he was really interested in sort of material and light and kind of honesty of like physical things. And, so the video, there was still kind of a decent amount of video in it, but it was a different kind of approach. We were thinking more about the set itself and sort of had different materials would react in terms of light and shade, and like using real shadow a lot and things like that. And so it was a really nice, but again, the entire process was like a direct line of communication with him, which is a dream, really. You don't have to go through a lot of layers of people and sort of things get analyzed by a lot. I mean, he's one of those people. I'll send him a test, and then as I'm leaving the office, get on the tube. Half an hour later, as I get out of the tube, I'll see a response that's always useful, usually very positive, but always useful. And it's like that is a dream, a dream client really for me. Like I'm never guessing.
Rather than waiting till they get to rehearsals before they get.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which has happened
regularly.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I guess then you have to test it in real time before the first show. Obviously, there's a lot of testing done before, but
yeah,
you only build this one massive set, on day one, right? So you've got to cross your fingers. What sort of
really
animation and technologies, on the software side, are you using? I know you mentioned Notch the other time we talked.
Yeah, we use Notch quite a lot. We, I mean, from my point of view, because of, as I said before, my background being more sort of animation and editing, like my starting point is usually something like After Effects, which is where I sort of start, even if it's just sort of sketching things to start with. Say After Effects and Cinema 4D is where a lot of the stuff gets made, and then Notch is really useful for bringing that kind of live element to it. And we've been really lucky because we kind of met Matt from Notch before it was actually Notch, when he was sort of first starting out, and we kind of built a relationship from the start, which again was just fantastic for us because he, it would literally be like, think up an idea. I'd sort of think, can we do this? And he'd be like, give me a couple of days and sort of basically write things to make it work, so that was obviously just fantastic. And it's been a lovely journey together, so he's, that's grown, and it's, obviously now, maybe not a household name, but it's certainly a big name. And it's really nice to have been sort of on that journey with them. And it is lovely, there's something to be said for both, there's sometimes it's really nice to have that kind of pre-made thing that exactly what it's going to do, but there is something really lovely about having that kind of little wild edge sometimes. And we did about 5 years ago a show for Kasabian where it was slightly terrifying because the entire show from start to finish was Notch and triggered live. We had like Connect cameras all over the stage scanning each of the guys in the band, and obviously we had a design for each song, but everything you saw happened in that moment. There was nothing. I think there was a couple of elements where I'd make maybe a few layers that were pre-made, but essentially, if it didn't work, you wouldn't have seen. there wouldn't have been anything, and thankfully it did.
They're absolutely my favourite kind of shows, actually.
Yeah, it was pretty excited every time.
And there's nothing wrong with the other. Obviously, every theatre and musical you ever see, that's a series of pre-designed states that is stepped through. But for live music, there's nothing like it. And I've never quite done it, but I've always had a fantasy about doing a show where all of the visual material is made during the show. We've come close to it at times, but
fancy, right? Well, what will smart glasses do then? There's obviously varying options in the market now, but you've got Facebook and Apple releasing a really high quality visual smart glass in the next year or two. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, as you said, Willie, the amount of people that watch concerts now through their phone, this has been going on because they're videoing everything. Right?
At its theoretical best, it could become the sort of contemporary version of 3D glasses for a movie, where you build a set specifically to respond. Everyone have to have the same gear and everything, but you build a set that specifically responds to the equipment, and then you make a show. And so, you'd save a fortune on pyro for starters, but all of the effects would be built into that thing. And I think that's interesting. Whereas, as I say, for our AR experiment, where it was just this one particular piece of the show, because most of our task revolved around educating the audience in what it is and how to see it, it became a very different thing. But I say, I think there really is potential, because obviously the sky's the limit. Wardrobe, all sorts of things. You can create this completely other world based around a live performance. And contra to contrary to how I feel about a lot of the emerging technology for live performance, I think that does have great potential. I think that could be really quite fun.
Yeah, the fact that you're not having to kind of hold, you know, I think it's just something you're wearing and it's part. I suppose the thing, like you say, I mean, the 3D cinema thing is a really good example. It's like, for me, it would be whether, you know, is it essential or is it just adding something? And I think they're two different things that both have value. You know, like you could probably on different scales, you know, maybe like a smaller show where it is all about the glasses and you wouldn't really get anything, you wouldn't really get the show without them. I think that would have a lot of value, you know, but probably would work more in a kind of sort of more theatrical kind of smaller scale kind of world where, yeah, you could create a whole world that kind of comes to
I don't know.
or you just go big.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
the other thing we've just
you imagine something like you imagine something like the UT 360 show which was in a stadium in the round, and that with a permanent layer of mixed reality over the top of it. I mean, it would be fantastic. The entire thing bursts into flames.
I mean, that was almost like virtual reality anyway, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was almost.
No, I think that does have potential, and somebody will do it.
Actually, talking about that 360 show, I did see that, and I thought it was a really interesting, instead of, you know, perspective on the stage where you've got, you know, the round stage versus the stage in the back, you know, at the music festival. How was that reaction? And I did have a question for you guys about when you go around to the different countries. I mean, I've seen audience reactions in Japan. They're quite
they're getting better,
I should say. But compared to other countries, I mean, from South America to Europe to the US, what have you found also in audience reaction to your work as well? That's why I asked that question as well.
Well, Latin countries are always...
It's hard to beat South America.
Slam dunk, you know. Yeah. Although I have to say, since mobile phones hit Mexico, that's sort of the end of their audiences. That was quite interesting. They used to be amongst the most animated audiences in the world, but they're now doing the phone thing. Generally, the further south you go, the more excited the audience gets. I'm not sure whether that's a weather thing, but you know, it doesn't. They just have different personalities, really. You know, in the US, it's very much about valet parking and having a seat and buying a program, but that doesn't mean that they're not enjoying it. Whereas for the benefit of the show, obviously the more vocal an audience is, the better, really. You know, just the more engagement. As I say, for some of the Latin audiences, it's not about watching; it's about being part of this event. You know? And particularly for that 360 show, because what was great about that 360 show. The great thing about being in the round, of course, is you halve the distance from the stage to the furthest seat. So it immediately feels more intimate. But because you can sell every seat in the building, plus put 20,000 people on the pitch or more, we were getting about 30% increase on a regular sellout capacity of a stadium. And if you got 30% more people, that means they're 30% louder than a regular audience. And in an enclosed space in a stadium, it was incredible. And some of the South American audiences, it was absolutely astonishing. And it's like a feedback loop because they can see everyone's facing the stage, but everyone's also facing each other. And that was a less video-heavy show necessarily. It was more of an architectural thought, really. It was a sort of more sculptural piece, and you really did feel the audience feeding off each other. It was quite something, and again, a very different sort of atmosphere to a one-end video-based show.
Is there a particular explosion or special effect over the years that you've done that absolutely floored the audience? And whether that was the first time you've done the LED walls or a 15-minute explosion display around the band's feet or whatever it might have been. Is there something that you can recall that just flawed? Because I know, Damian, you were saying, you know, you love to see the reaction of the crowd. Maybe you guys could give us an example each of or two of something like that.
I mean, for me, it's probably not one of the sort of smaller shows that I'd like way back. I was doing a show that was almost like it was kind of like a massive club almost. It was like a dance music kind of event, which was but quite large scale, and you know that traveled the world, and we'd do this sort of outdoor kind of pop-up shows. And again, as we were just saying, South America was always incredible. and that's probably the one place where I've had that, you know, that I remember doing Argentina and Chile and Puerto Rico actually, and people genuinely coming up to us kind of crying, because we'd make sort of I'd run around the city the day or two before the show and film lots of stuff and can take photos of millions of things, and basically really quickly, I mean, it wasn't my finest work, the actual what I was making, but basically trying to make a chunk of the show that was bespoke to the place it was in, you know, and that was always an incredible buzz to see, you know, when you kind of, you'd save it until a sort of big bit of the night and then start to sort of bleed in the stuff that they would recognize, and they'd also recognize quite often that it was not pre-made, that it was, you could tell maybe by something that was in town at the time might pop up, and they'd see that it's literally, it's here and it's now, and people would come up kind of crying and kissing us and sort of hugging us and stuff, you know, especially in some of, like, so Puerto Rico, for example, I've never felt anything quite like the moment I sort of brought up the flag, that I'd filmed a flag, just happened to have filmed a flag the day before, just in the center of in the center of town, and just sort of suddenly put it on the screen, and the atmosphere just went crazy, and people were coming up to us kind of, yeah, like I say, hugging us and sort of like tears in their eyes and stuff. It was really kind of, that is hard to you know, that level of personal kind of feedback was pretty amazing, yeah. And I suppose the flip side is, as you were saying earlier, Willie, like seeing sort of tens of thousands of people kind of tuning into something, and when the mood kind of rises or drops with something,
yeah,
you know, you've been part of, even though the music is the main thing that's taking them there, you know, there are times when you sort of see an image and you hear a kind of gasp or something, and that's, you know, that's a pretty special feeling. Yeah.
What about you, Willie? What are you thinking?
Well, again, it really is about connection. And what's great about what Dame just said is, obviously, that's real connection when the audience knows that the performer knows exactly where they are, and they made a special effort, and they really want to communicate. And the emotions, you can't really predict what they are. It's funny with Joshua Tree, the anniversary tour that we just did with you two. That was a real crying show. It was extraordinary. Men cried at that show. It was quite odd, and whether it was about, you know, lost youth or this, that, and the other. But if I'd had to list all the reactions I imagined that would provoke, men crying would not have been one of them. Australian men cried. It was very odd, and so that's always interesting. You sort of build the machine, and you're not 100% sure what it's going to do. But sort of to answer your question, I mean, one of my favourite things ever was DMX Pyro, when you can build a rhythmic fireworks show, essentially, especially at scale. It was fantastic. We did Robbie Williams's sort of comeback stadium tour a few years ago, and Angels, of course, is the big closer, and what are you going to do with that? And so with the German company, we did a bespoke pyro firework show that was entirely DMX controlled, and it was amazing. Wow. And it always worked. Yeah, that was great fun. And again, the audience love it, because pyro is such a cheap hit. And so if you can throw something extra in like that, where they realize that somebody somewhere is playing this thing, that was a real pleasure to design.
I mean, talking about budgets for a minute, I know it's probably a confidential subject, but you know, some of these tours, I mean, I went to see Queen as well with Adam, and you know, incredible show, by the way. And I took my two children, who just videoed the entire show. You know, it was that impressive, right? This is a few years ago, right? But you know, I mean, I'm just trying to see, where is this industry going in terms of the next level of, you know, interactive and just experience for live events. I mean, you know, in the next 5 years, 10 years, do you think the virtual concerts like what Travis Scott did on Fortnite will start to take on a new form of entertainment, you know, on a regular basis? I mean, you've got a younger audience now, under 18, experiencing a virtual concert. They've been allowed to go to probably a large rock concert, of course. Yeah. It's a family-orientated one. But I mean,
I think the upside is that music has been so kind of out of fashion, really, for younger audiences, you know, because there's so much other stuff that if a blending of the technologies brings music into a more central position for teenagers, then I think that's great, even if it's not in a form that I personally would particularly enjoy. I mean, I think it's really great because it definitely has lost, music certainly doesn't have the central meaning. I mean, Damian and I both basically ran away from home because of music.
Yeah. And as you said, you're not going to get, there's a lot of things you will never get from a virtual experience, but there's also a lot of things that you can't get without, there's that you can only get with a virtual experience. So I think it will have to be seen as a different thing, and maybe it's something that speaks slightly, well, I don't know, it definitely speaks slightly to a kind of newer generation, but I think there'll be things that would, I'm not sure they're happening right now, but I think there will definitely be things that will appeal to different age groups. I mean, talking about that sort of the Travis Scott thing, I've got my friend's kid is now a massive fan just because of Fortnite. But he didn't know him beforehand, but he's a massive Fortnite fan. And my 9-year-old wants to make a virtual nightclub in Minecraft because I was talking to him about the people I've been working for who, DJs and things who can't work at the moment because of that. And, no, it might not be for me, but like there's a lot to be said for it. And as I think I said to you before, when I was sort of 12, 13, I can remember trying to talk my parents into letting me go and see Public Enemy and failing. So if I could have watched that on a headset, I think it would have been wonderful for me. So I think it's just got to be seen as something slightly different, but it's something that's also not going away and is only going to get better and more interesting. It just isn't going to replace that. There's never going to be anything like being in a kind of throbbing crowd of people when you can sort of feel it and smell it and the atmosphere is there, and you get that feeling of all the eyes looking in the same direction and all kind of hearts beating at the same time. But having said that, there's fantastic things you can do that are impossible in the real world. So Yep. Yeah, and I guess things like the current situation are going to do nothing but push that along, because we're all screaming out for something to do and some way of being entertained at the moment. And, option A isn't open. So, yes, yeah.
And Willie, we're just coming to the end of the interview, but is there any final comments from you guys that you want to make? Yeah, you were just about to say something.
No, I just think, because you touched on financing, and one of the things that's possibly interesting about technology and entertainment combining is obviously that kind of stuff is paid for in a very different way. Concerts at the end of the day, even though it's all about t-shirt sales and car parking and everything, it still is a very simple exchange. People go and see something and pay for it, and that's what funds the whole operation. Whereas with the emerging technologies, that's very much more about venture capital and IPOs and all that kind of thing. And you see, companies like Magic Leap, who has raised staggering amounts of capital for years and didn't produce anything for years until they did. And if that kind of funding is driving the next level of entertainment, then perhaps it stands a chance outside of because obviously the live music industry not in such great shape at the moment. But it might make it slightly more bulletproof in terms of funding if the money's coming from elsewhere.
Excellent. Well, look, Damian and Willie, it's been a pleasure to catch up today. Really enjoyed hearing the stories, even the Frank Sinatra one. That must have been
we'll come back to that.
We can talk about that offline for part 2. But look, I really appreciate your thoughts and the examples and the emerging tech. And look, amazing work that you've done over the years. And I have experienced quite a large number of your events down under, of course. So I appreciate your time today, and we'll catch you soon. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you.
Cheers.